Hi guys, I noticed that many of you have been waiting for the new chapter release of Shadow Slave, so I made a continuation of the narration to keep you from waiting too long to enjoy this peak web novel. I hope you like it. Enjoy. Shadow Slave. Chapter 2841 Divine Chariot. The chain breaker flew through the boundless black abyss of the sky above the forgotten shore, surrounded by silence. There were no stars and no moon above them, and the ground was shrouded in utter darkness. It felt as if they were floating through a lightless, endless void. The light of the lanterns hanging from the masts of the chain breaker seemed feeble and weak in the face of this vast, lightless expanse. Sunny could see the terrain far below the flying ship perfectly well, of course. However, Nephise had been rendered blind. She pulled the oars gently, slowing down the ship, and sighed. "I'd close my eyes if I were you." Sunny followed her advice and closed his eyes, then covered them with a hand. Nephise inhaled deeply, then channeled her essence and invoked the true name of light in a simple but powerful verse. In the next moment, the hull of the chain breaker ignited with a blinding white radiance, so blinding in fact that Sunny felt a great change in the shadows above, below, and around them. The shadows fled away from the light like an oceanic tide, and just from the scale of that sudden migration, he could tell that an area spanning hundreds of kilometers across was now illuminated. The desolate, barren terrain of the forgotten shore was instantly bathed in light. It was as if a new sun had risen above it after long years of cold darkness. That sun was the chain breaker, which flew across the sky like a divine chariot. Sunny carefully opened his eyes, giving them time to adjust to the sudden daylight. Nephise was still steering the chain breaker, looking ahead impassively. She remained silent for a few moments, then said, "It seems this is my limit. If I were sacred, I would have probably been able to illuminate the entirety of the forgotten shore." Looking at him, she smiled faintly, a hint of a strange, bittersweet emotion in her eyes. "Then I'd really be able to replace a sun." Just as she said that, the ruins of the Crimson Spire appeared on the horizon. Nephise and Sunny did not say anything to each other, but there was a tacit understanding between them. She sent the chain breaker into a descent, and when it reached the ground, Sunny summoned a cradle made out of shadows to support its weight. Soon enough, they were standing on the rubble of the great tower that had once supported the weight of the sun. Some distance away, the statue of the builder was kneeling in the dust, holding its head. Behind them, hidden in the towering mountain of shattered black stone, the dark sea was waiting silently beneath the seal. Nephise looked around, her face betraying no emotion. She did not seem interested in the dark sea and its seal, and while the massive figure of the kneeling builder held her attention for a while, eventually, she simply walked past it and crossed the bridge that led to the sea of dust beyond. There two hills stood side by side. One was a barrow built from black stone, from the shattered pieces of the Crimson Spire. The other was an eerie mountain of monstrous bones, tall enough to dwarf the barrow. They were the grave of the sleepers who had fought and lost their lives on this battlefield, and the bones of the nightmare creatures they had slain. Nephise approached the barrow and stood beneath it, looking up. Her eyes traveled to the words carved into the black stone. "Here lie those who extinguished the sun. Dreamers of the dark city. Sleep well. Your nightmare is over." Nephise remained motionless for a long while. Eventually she asked, "Who buried them?" Sunny shifted slightly. "I did." She lowered her head and let out an almost inaudible sigh. "Thank you." Her words fell heavy into the ashen silence. After some time, Nephise turned back and looked at the ruins of the Crimson Spire. "People call me a hero, you know, for leading the sleepers of the dark city back to the waking world. But actually there was nothing heroic about it." She paused for a moment. "I merely used them to achieve my goals. I needed an army to reach the gateway, and for that I needed to wrestle authority out of Gunlog's hands. So I simply made myself into the opposite of Gunlaf. I didn't really know much about people back then, but becoming the opposite of the man who oppressed them was simple enough." Nephise smiled bitterly. "Of course, I sincerely believed that laying siege to the Crimson Spire was the best choice for all of them, the only choice. But still, I did it for myself. I did it to pursue my goals." Sunny studied her silently for a few moments, then asked, "Would you have done anything differently if you had a choice?" Nephise looked at him in surprise. Done anything differently, of course I wouldn't have failed. Sunny raised an eyebrow, then gestured to the ruins of the Crimson Spire. It doesn't seem like you failed though. If anything, it looks like you succeeded completely. Nephise laughed quietly. If I succeeded, there would have been far more survivors. Most of all, I wouldn't have ended up stuck in the dream realm for 2 years. She looked at the ruins of the Crimson Spire and sighed. Granted, I don't quite remember what transpired there. The battle against the Crimson Terror must have been too taxing. I figured out the mechanics of the spire too late, I think. Castor was already dead by then, so there was no one to make the conduit instead of me. Oh, Castor was a legacy whom the sovereigns had sent to kill me. He died in the spire. Sunny smiled and looked away. Still, you were victorious in the end, weren't you? Nephise studied the ruins of the Crimson Spire once more. Eventually she said, Victorious? Oh, no, not at all. I only ever tasted defeat for the longest time. Chapter 28:42 The Winner Takes It All. Nephise inhaled deeply and then turned away from the ruins of the spire she had destroyed. Her lips curved into a bittersweet smile. It might not look like it from the outside, considering how glorious and exalted the image of Changing Star, the last daughter of the immortal flame, is, but what led me here was not a string of triumphant victories. Rather, to me, it seems like the story of my life is a story of being defeated over and over again, losing everything over and over again, not knowing how to give up. So if I do have one virtue, that virtue is perseverance, not valor. She sighed and gazed upon the desolate expanse of the forgotten shore with a distant look in her eyes. When I came here, I was so young, so naive. I did not know anything and did not have anything except for my anger. I was so full of anger that it felt like it was scathing me from the inside, and I naively believed that my anger would take me as far as I wanted to go. But of course, there were a lot of lessons I had to learn. Nephise looked down. It was smooth sailing at the start, but once I reached the dark city, the cracks began to show. People I trusted the most lost confidence in me and left me. I managed to defeat Gunlog just like I had planned to, but everything after that was a mess. I never expected that seizing power after his death would be so difficult. Every person who died in the senseless civil war that followed was one less warrior to lay siege to the Crimson Spire, and every death felt like a personal failure of mine. She smiled bitterly. There were more than 1,000 sleepers in the dark city when I arrived, and that number was reduced by more than half before we even reached the Crimson Spire. In the end, only 100 made it out alive. And while I was still alive, I did not make it out. Needless to say, I would hesitate to call that a victory. Sunny listened to her silently. He could not explain that he had been there too, that he had been by her side, surviving the same events and learning the same lessons, that she had stayed behind so that he could escape. So he couldn't do anything but stay quiet. It was fascinating, though, to hear about the events of that distant past from her perspective. Nephise had seemed like an icon of stalwart, uncompromising certainty to him back then. It was odd to know that she had been nothing more than an angry, naive kid who doubted herself and was hurt by her failures just like the rest of them. It was just that she had hidden her vulnerable side well. No, actually, it was that she had been given no choice but to hide her vulnerable side. She was their leader, after all, so she could not show weakness in front of people who saw her as their only hope, because if she did, their last hope would be shattered. Sunny had experienced the same burden much later, in Antarctica. He sighed. You were just a teenager thrown into an impossible situation by the nightmare spell. You did your best, and your best was damn good. No one else would have been able to do better. Sunny certainly would not have. His plan back then had been to hide and live the rest of his life in the dark city, slowly going insane while forgetting what the word hope even meant. He had been young and naive too. Nephise smiled slightly. Well, it wasn't all bad, to be honest. Even if I failed to escape, I learned a valuable lesson here on the forgotten shore. I learned that the end did not justify the means, and that I only wanted to succeed in a manner that felt worthy. It is a good thing that I learned that precious lesson so early all those years ago. If I didn't, somewhere along the way I would have probably become nothing more than just another king of swords, just another queen of worms, or just another dream spawn. I would have become the very thing that I hate. She sighed and looked east. After the Crimson Spire was destroyed, I was still full of single-minded confidence. That confidence was only broken in my second nightmare where I suffered an utter, crushing defeat, and with my confidence, I was broken as well. It broke me. Nephise shook her head. Later, I had to bow my head to the tyrants I hated, smile at the man whom I wanted to kill, bide my time while the great clans were allowing the chain of nightmares to consume Antarctica, and close my eyes to the crimes they committed against humanity. I was overly cautious and hesitant. I was a coward, and I only managed to regain my resolve in the depths of the third nightmare, in twilight. She chuckled and looked at Sunny. However, even that was only possible because of someone else. After all, in the original cycle of the Great River I died. I was killed by my own companions. That was where my story was supposed to end, I guess, but it did not, and I don't even know why. Nephi's looked at him, lingered for a few moments, and then said, "You know better than I do." Sunny was startled by her words. Before he could come up with an answer, though, she already looked away. After the tomb of Ariel came the greatest of my perceived triumphs, attaining supremacy, slaying the sovereigns and usurping their throne, becoming the ruler of humanity. But if I were truly as valiant and intrepid as people think, there would have never been a war in Godgrave. I would have defeated the sovereigns long before they could cause all that death and all that devastation. You know it well, our victory there was the result of a desperate gamble. It was luck. Sunny studied her for a while, then shook his head. You are right, it was luck. However, luck is not something that happens to you, it's something that you make happen. Luck only offers its hand to those who can grasp it, so don't sell yourself short. Nephi's chuckled. Perhaps. She lingered for a while, then looked at the Black Barrow one last time. Elam Supreme now, the shining goddess of humanity. Yet still, the dream spawn crushed me effortlessly as soon as he arrived. I couldn't do anything to thwart him, so I was defeated once again. Look around us. In the end, all I could do was abandon my people and run away. Sunny raised an eyebrow and asked in a teasing tone. So what, are you going to give up? Nephi's faced him and smiled. Naturally not. As I said, perseverance is my only virtue. It doesn't matter how many defeats I suffer because I am always the one left standing in the end. I always rise back up no matter how many times I'm pushed to the ground because I am still naive and young, and I still don't know how to give up. Being good at failure is also a skill, you know. Turning away from the barrow, she headed back to the chain breaker. So, let's make sure to win this time. When this is over, the dream spawn will be the one sprawled in the mud while we will be the ones standing above him. Because, she glanced at Sunny and winked. You and me, who dares to stop us? Chaoter 2843, where it all began. Sunny wanted to host Nephi's in his castle, but sadly they had to steer clear of the Dark City. The thralls of Asterion were still imprisoned in the settlement below its walls, and on top of that, he did not entirely trust the members of the Shadow Clan either. Asterion had already shown his ability to subjugate people without stealing them from the domain of the Supreme they were loyal to, after all. Saint Thane, the dream merchant, must have regretted being born as a result. Nephi's had been consumed by wrath after Red Hill fell, so when their investigation pointed at the eccentric saint and his treachery was revealed, she simply turned him into a screaming bonfire. He did not scream for long, though, because the immolating white flames stole his voice. Nephi's burned the enthralled saint until there was nothing left of him but a shriveled, blackened stick figure. But she did not kill him. Instead, she used the same flames to restore him to flawless health, and then burned him again and again, again and again, until the name Asterion became synonymous with harrowing pain in his mind. In the end, the agony and the horror proved terrifying enough to overpower the Asterion's hex, erasing it. And yet, Sunny did not think that the enthralled saint had been happy to have his mind cleansed and his free will restored. He was not sure, though, because by the time they left, the dream merchant had not regained his ability to form coherent sentences yet. Needless to say, Neph's method of healing people of the plague was even less scalable than Cassie's. So Sunny could not take her to the Dark City. The chain breaker traveled east for some time, and when they drew close enough to the city for the light emanating from the flying ship to be seen from the walls, Nephi's released her channeling and let the world drown in darkness once more. Sunny replaced her at the oars. It had been a long while since he last steered the chain breaker, but his task was not difficult, they simply had to keep heading east. Sunny and Nephi's left the Dark City behind and crossed the colossal crater that they had traversed more than a decade ago on a boat made from the bones of the carapace demon. Beyond it lay the ashen barrow and the charred remains of the soul-devouring tree. All that was left of the fearsome terror was an enormous blackened stump, its jagged mass emanating an eerie sense of dread and malevolence. The chain breaker continued on its way east. Soon enough, they flew above the headless statue of the knight that was where Sunny had begun his journey once. The small clearing in the labyrinth of crimson coral nearby was where he met Nephis and Cassie. Of course, there was no clearing anymore. The coral labyrinth was gone, after all, having turned to ash when the crimson spire fell. Nephis did not remember their meeting either. Still, she must have retraced her footsteps and visited these places while traveling to the Nightmare Desert. She had remembered him back then. Sunny wondered what Nephis thought about while walking through the darkness alone. Nephis seemed to be remembering those times as well. The hardest part was not the loneliness, not the cold, not the hunger, and not the nightmare creatures either. It was water. I was dying from thirst the second time I traveled through these parts. Leaning on the railing, Nephis smiled. Luckily, even though the cycle of day and night was gone by then, the weather still remained. There was a storm once I reached the night, and I was able to both quench my thirst and store some water. Sunny remained silent for a while, thinking idly about his own wanderings across the forgotten shore. Eventually he said, "You know, I took Slayer to the statue of the Slayer once." She was not impressed. Nephis laughed quietly. "That was where Cassie's rapier came from, the sword grave around that statue. It was a truly lethal affair. We barely made it out alive." Sunny sighed. "You know, every time I see these statues, I think to myself, now that I rule the forgotten shore, nothing is stopping me from bringing their heads back and attaching them to their necks. So I always wonder, should I?" Nephis turned her head at the sound of his voice. "Why haven't you?" Sunny considered his answer for a few brief moments. "I'm not entirely sure. The Crimson Terror, the Nameless Sun, took off their heads because she hated them and wanted them to be forgotten. She was entitled to her hatred, considering what they had done to her, don't you think? So I don't really want them to be remembered either. Plus, restoring the statues would feel like erasing history, and I am a big enthusiast of history." Eventually, they saw a line of pale lilac far away, on the very edge of the horizon. That was where the forgotten shore ended, and the Nightmare Desert began. Soon enough, they escaped the eternal darkness and dove into blinding sunlight. The cool winds were suddenly satiated by a blazing heat, and Sunny had to cover his eyes with a hand, hissing quietly. The switch between darkness and light was so abrupt that it seemed like someone had pressed a button, changing the world to a different channel. Sunny had not visited the Nightmare Desert since before his third nightmare. Now that he saw the endless expanse of flawlessly white dunes stretching into the distance once again, and the unreachable black triangle of the tomb of Ariel looming on the horizon, too, he perceived it differently. The first time around, all he could think about was how to survive in this mysterious hell. Looking at the Nightmare Desert now, though, Sunny was thinking about something else despite the imminent battle against the armies of the cursed undead that inhabited it. He was thinking about the Demon of Dread and the unholy Titan whom Ariel had destroyed. This land had not always been a desert. It had been an ocean once, and that ocean was erased from existence by the ferocious battle between a demon and the Stone Titan. The corpse of the Stone Titan became the walls of the tomb of Ariel, and his blood became the great river. The 7 shards of his soul became the suns that illuminated it, and if Sunny was not mistaken in his suspicion, the space within the colossal pyramid had been fashioned from the Titan's soul sea. And a tiny shard of that primordial horror became Goliath, the fallen Titan who ravaged the Antarctic center thousands of years later. That was the scale of battles between deities. Entire worlds were destroyed while some were born instead. The mortal realm where the Stone Titan fell had become a lifeless desert, and even thousands of years later it was still dead. Before, this knowledge was purely theoretical as far as Sunny was concerned, but now it wasn't anymore, not at all. One step on the path of ascension, that was all that separated Sunny from battling creatures like the Stone Titan himself. Would he be able to do what Ariel had done? And how many worlds would be destroyed in the process? The chain breaker began to descend, and soon landed on the very edge of the white sands. At that moment, Nephis suddenly turned her head and looked south at the distant black wall of the Hollow Mountains. Or perhaps beyond them. Sensing a subtle shift in her presence, Sunny frowned. "What is it?" Nephis hesitated, then lowered her head and closed her eyes for a moment. "There is one less citadel in my soul sea, and all its people vanished from my domain. Asterion must have taken another saint." Neither of them said anything for a while after that. Instead, they simply faced the nightmare desert, looking at the distant silhouette of Ariel's tomb. The vast expanse of the white desert shone under the radiant sun. Chapter 28, 44 Sands of Time. The longing domain did not have a lot of time left, and yet, oddly enough, Sunny and Nephise had nothing to do at the moment. They had reached the nightmare desert in the early morning with the radiant sun slowly climbing the vibrant azure expanse of the sky. The tomb of Ariel loomed on the horizon, but it was impossible to reach it. No matter how long one walked across the white sands, it never drew closer. They had never attempted to traverse the nightmare desert at night, though, when the two cursed armies turned it into a deadly battlefield. Sunny and Nephise both believed that the tomb of Ariel could only be reached at night, so for now, all they could do was wait. This was probably the last day of peace they would know for a while. The nightmare desert was vast, and even if their theory proved to be correct, it was going to take a lot of time to reach its heart, days, weeks more likely. Especially so because they would be fighting their way through a vast horde of undying beings who had been cursed by Shadow God to an eternity of endless war. Shadow God had been quite a merciless one, it seemed. After all, he had not only cursed the army that fought under the banner of the rebellious demons, his curse befell the warriors of the divine host as well, making no distinction between friend or foe. But what else would Sunny expect from the god of death? He and Nephise remained aboard the chain breaker, watching the desert silently. Growing tired of the heat, they retreated into the captain's cabin of the flying ship. Sunny remembered how the two of them had slept here during their journey to fallen grace. Nephise, of course, did not. There was probably something useful they could do until the night fell, like meditating to clear their minds or going over the battle plan a few more times. But neither of them wanted to waste their last day of peace on rote tedium. After all, there was a real chance that they would not return from this expedition alive, or at least that both of them would. They were painfully aware of each other's presence, which filled the cabin with a heated pressure. Neff's presence ignited Sunny's longing, and her aspect allowed her to sense the flame of his desire. A light touch turned into a kiss, and a kiss turned into something more. In the end, they used the remaining time until nightfall to indulge themselves, engaged in passion and engrossed in each other with fervor and intensity that were as deliberate as they were frenetic, putting the sturdiness of the chain breaker to the test. Eventually, overcome by a sweet exhaustion, they cuddled on the sweaty sheets to rest and recover. Sunny was reminded of what Effie had said to him once, that when one was facing death, they wanted to feel alive more than ever. He was looking at the ceiling of the cabin, his thoughts moving slowly. His mind drifted to the last time he and Nephise had spent time together in this cabin, and then to the future. Soon they would invade the nightmare desert. If they survived that, they would enter the tomb of Ariel. If they were to survive that as well, they would face the vile thieving bird in battle. And if they survived that too, Sunny would most likely regain his fate. That meant regaining his true name, surrendering to the shadow bond once again, becoming a carrier of the nightmare spell for the second time, restoring his ability to challenge the fifth nightmare. And most importantly, it meant that Sunny would be remembered. That was something he had wanted for the longest time, and at times with desperate intensity. He had spent years unsure and not knowing what to do, only recently deciding that he did not want to be forgotten anymore. That he wanted to be remembered by the people he held dear once again. But now that the prospect of being remembered ceased to be a merely theoretical possibility and seemed to be within his grasp, Sunny suddenly found himself afraid. Yes, people would regain their memories of him. Nephise would know what they had endured on the forgotten shore together and why she stayed behind in the collapsing Crimson Spire. She would remember how they slept in this very cabin as the great river carried the chain breaker downstream into the past. She would know that this was not the first time the two of them had come to the nightmare desert together. However, she would also remember how Sunny had abandoned her in Verge to face the first seeker alone, how he had run away to fulfill his own selfish, misguided desire. She would remember his betrayal. A heavy sigh escaped from his lips. How would Nephise react if she remembered him? Would she be happy? Would she be angry? Would she slap him across the face, perhaps full of scathing accusations? Or would she kiss and embrace him instead, most of all? Would their fragile relationship survive that revelation? This closeness between them had not come easily. Sunny had worked tirelessly to build it, even if the foundation on which he was building it was missing. He often felt unsatisfied and saddened by the fact that the relationship between him and Nephi's, while intimate and harmonious, did not run that deep. But now that there was a possibility that their peculiar relationship would end, he found himself treasuring it immensely. He didn't want to lose what they had now. He was already happy with what they had now. He was content. But he was also greedy and wanted more, so much more. You're thinking greedy thoughts again. Nephi's was playing with a stand of his hair, letting the black silk of it run between her fingers. She smiled faintly. Your eyes glisten a certain way when you do. Sunny turned his head and glanced at her silently. She looked into his eyes. No space between them. In the end, she turned away and sighed. I know every inch of you by heart, but I also don't know anything about you. It's so vexing. He remained silent for a bit, then hugged her from behind and drew her closer. What was he supposed to say? It won't be for much longer. Soon, you'll know everything about me soon once again. That was what he wanted to tell her. But instead of saying these words aloud, Sunny smiled. I'm not too tall, so there aren't that many inches of me to begin with, still quite impressive. Nephi's laughed quietly. Soon the brilliant sun melted into the dark horizon. Their time of peace had run out. Before we head to the next chapter, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thanks. Chapter 28:45 Deathless. The sun was slowly disappearing behind the horizon, and the world was painted by a million shades of dark crimson. In that fiery blaze, the endless sea of white dunes seemed to be drowning in blood. The eastern sky was already submerged in deep shadows, and the suffocating heat of the desert was slowly surrendering to the tyranny of cold winds. Sunny and Nephi's ascended to the deck of the chain breaker, ready for battle. He walked to the railing and jumped down, landing on the sand softly. A moment later, Nephi's landed next to him. Rotating his shoulder to loosen his muscles, Sunny sighed and looked east. Their 6 figures were waiting for him motionlessly, their silhouettes countered against the crimson sky like black statues. They were, of course, none other than Sunny himself. After a long time apart, all 7 of his incarnations were finally reunited. Smiling darkly, Sunny headed toward his avatars. Funny meeting you here, gentlemen. To what do I owe the pleasure? Another avatar sighed and shook his head. Talking to yourself again? You know, this joke was funny the first few hundred times, but now it's just tacky. We should really put it out of its misery. A different avatar frowned in indignation. Hey, funny is funny. That joke is not overdone, it's a classic. Another nodded in solidarity. Yeah, you are just jealous because, unlike us, you can't pull it off. The first incarnation stared at him in disbelief. We are literally the same person. What exactly can't I pull off that you can? Reaching the 6 avatars, Sunny shook his head. Shut up, fools. They looked at him somberly. Who are you calling a fool, you fool? There are 6 of us and 1 of you. What are you going to do if we don't, huh? Sunny grinned. Nephi's, meanwhile, observed the scene with a strange expression. Eventually, she turned to the original Sunny and spoke in a neutral tone. The dead are going to rise soon, are you ready? He shrugged. As ready as I can be, I guess. With that, Sunny regarded the nightmare desert with a dark expression. One of his avatars sighed. This place offends me. A different incarnation nodded. Yes, I am supposed to be the sovereign of death after all, but lo and behold, there is an entire horde of beings here who have cheated death. Another one scratched the back of his head. Well, to be fair, it is more like they have been cheated out of death, Shadow God's curse and all that. Sunny grimaced. I guess we will have to deal with the mess Shadow God left behind. Nephi's interrupted the banter in a serious tone. The deathless will begin rising from the sand soon. They won't pay attention to us, at least not immediately, but getting past them without being annihilated will be impossible. We will have to fight our way through, and soon after we involve ourselves in the battle, both sides will most likely endeavor to destroy us. She paused for a moment and then added, Luckily, it is not all bad news. I did not make it far into the nightmare desert as a sleeper, but since I was traveling during the day, I had a chance to observe the deathless across various parts of the desert. Here on its outskirts, they are not that strong, which makes sense once you think about it as an ancient battlefield. The elite troops are buried closer to the heart of the desert, where the curse of Shadow God fell upon them. Only the weakest troops remained in the rear. She inhaled deeply. Of course, their weakness is relative. To a sleeper, each of the countless undead seemed like an unimaginable, insurmountable obstacle, and even for a supreme they won't be simple to defeat. Nevertheless, our goal today is to get as far into the desert as we can. At the same time, we must use this opportunity to learn how to fight the Deathless, because once we draw closer to the tomb of Ariel, we'll have to face the true champions. Sunny looked at her, then turned to face the Nightmare Desert. Remind me again, why don't we just fly the chain breaker above them and hide in the clouds? Nephi shook her head. Because the Deathless are capable of erasing the stars in the night sky, destroying one flying ship won't be difficult for them. Once one takes to the sky, they expose themselves to danger. After all, there is nothing to take cover behind in the sky. There is no ground to push against either, which means that there are very few ways to arrest your momentum. In short, you're a sitting duck. Well, a flying duck, I suppose. She looked at him and sighed. Plus, there's no clouds. Sunny regarded her silently for a moment. What the hell is no wait, a duck, I actually know that one. Looking up, Nephi's remained silent for a moment, and then said in a somber tone. I doubt that I'll be able to stay in the air myself, at least not for long, but we'll see. Fortunately, I am far more durable than the chain breaker. She turned to Sunny and finished calmly, needless to say, the Deathless cannot be killed, they cannot even be destroyed really, however, they can be damaged severely enough to be neutralized for a while. A faint smile appeared on her lips. In that sense, I guess your excursion into the Eternal City was good training for the Nightmare Desert. Sunny grimaced. How come every second adversary I meet can't be killed these days? Well, actually I can hardly be killed myself, I guess there's a balance. By then, the sun was already halfway hidden behind the horizon. The sands were moving, as if the entire desert was coming alive. Of course, it was the opposite, there was an army of the dead rising from its depths. Sunny looked ahead with a grim expression. Let's get this party started then. Chapter 28 46 Nightfall in the Nightmare Desert. As night descended upon the Nightmare Desert and the shadows drowned its vast expanse, Sunny took a step toward his 6 incarnations. One of his avatars turned into a shadow and glided across the sand, wrapping itself around his body. The darkness around Sunny suddenly seemed deeper, and his cold presence felt heavier. The second incarnation was absorbed into that darkness, making him stronger, then one more. With each layer of augmentation, Sunny felt stronger, faster, and more resilient. In fact, the fierce might coursing through his veins was so daunting that he had to grit his teeth, barely holding himself back from exploding forward. The 6 fragments of Weaver's lineage were making him stronger as well. Blood weave, bone weave, and flesh weave had fused to make every aspect of his corporeal manifestation more fearsome. Soul weave was making his essence more potent while simultaneously reinforcing his soul. Mind weave had made him capable of thinking 1,000 thoughts at the same time. Spirit weave, meanwhile. Spirit weave augmented his will, making the world far more malleable and dependent on his whims. The last 3 incarnations of Sunny turned into shadows as well. However, these 3 did not move to augment the leading avatar. Instead, 2 figures rose from them. Saint stood to Sunny's left, while Slayer stood to his right. Finally, Serpent slithered down from his arm and coiled on the white sand, the onyx scales contrasted sharply against it. The 3 shadows wrapped themselves around them, making each of the supreme shadows seem even more fearsome than a second before. Standing nearby, Nephi simply summoned the blessing. The radiant sword shone brightly, chasing the darkness away and making the shadows look deeper. She glanced at him, lingered for a moment, and sighed dejectedly. I never did have any luck with echoes, you know. Sunny turned to her with a slight grin. You just keep giving them away, though. If you didn't, you'd have an entire stable of powerful echoes already. Then gazing at his shadows, he added in a quieter tone. But not as powerful as my shadow cohort, of course. Slayer spared him a cold glance, while Saint summoned 2 torrents of liquid darkness that formed into a sword and a shield. Serpent just hissed and rippled, slowly assuming a human form, the form of a knight in heavy armor and a black cloak, 7 onyx swords hovering in the air behind him like black fangs. It had assumed the form of the King of Swords. Sunny was not done, of course. As the last vestige of the sun glowed red above the horizon, the deep shadows all around them surged and boiled. Then, countless shades marched onto the white sands in the Nightmare Desert, assembling into a vast battle formation. Some of them still wielded weapons salvaged in the Eternal City, some were encased in the armor from the martial pools of the Hippodrome. It was a fearsome sight. Sunny had summoned his entire legion here, leaving behind only a small number of shades that guarded the prison camp beside the Dark City and the Citadel in the burned forest. Hundreds of thousands of them were soon arrayed in front of the white dunes, waiting silently for the enemy to reveal itself like a sea of darkness. The Shadow Legion looked quite fearsome indeed. Sadly, it was not going to be too useful to Sunny and Nephise in their quest to reach the tomb of Ariel. After all, only a relatively small number of shades Sunny commanded were of a high enough rank to endure the battle against the Deathless. Most of them were too weak to survive the Nightmare Desert and would be sent back to his soul shortly. In this battle, their role was to serve as a flesh shield, well, rather a shadow shield, to give Sunny and Nephise enough time to learn more about the enemy and come up with a way to fight the Deathless effectively. He doubted that a tenth of his silent warriors would survive until dawn. And this first night would be the easiest of the unknown number of them Sunny and Nephise would have to survive in order to reach their goal. Worse still, the Deathless could not die, which meant that there would be no constant stream of new shades joining the Shadow Legion. Sunny glanced at the center of the battle formation where the shades from the Eternal City stood, ready for battle. A headache-inducing thought suddenly graced his mind. So, a legion of dead souls is preparing to battle a horde of deathless monsters, led by the shades of former immortals. All for their dead ruler to climb into a tomb, he chuckled. You know, I never thought I would return to the Nightmare Desert with such style. Nephise gave him a brief look. I've always meant to ask. Sunny turned to her. Yes. She pursed her lips slightly. Shadow Cohort, Shadow Legion, Lord of Shadows, Shades. Rain did mention that nomming things is a glaring flaw in your otherwise stellar collection of talents, but do you really just add shadow to everything when you need to name something? Sunny stared at her scandalized. What? Of course not. I am brilliant at giving things names. Take the Brilliant Emporium, for example. Can there even be a more brilliant name than that? Nephise just stared at him silently for a while, something suspiciously akin to pity in her gaze. Then she shifted it to his shadows. So let me get this straight. The snake is called Serpent, the killer is called Slayer, and the stone saint is called Saint. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Yes, what's wrong with that? Nephise remained silent for a few seconds, then lowered her gaze and looked at the blessing intently. I see, as it turns out I was lucky, I could have ended up with the sword. Sunny stared at her, mouth agape. Wow, damn it. The sword, why had he not thought of that? It sounded perfect. Just then something black appeared on the surface of the white sand in front of them. A skeletal hand rose from it, followed by a black skull and a towering torso. Everywhere Sunny glanced, the sand seemed to be boiling as countless skeletons slowly rose from it, clad in crumbling remains of rusted armor and armed with ancient weapons. The Nightmare Desert had finally fallen into the embrace of night. Chapter 28:47 First Shot. Everywhere Sunny looked, the Deathless were rising from beneath the dunes to resume their eternal battle. White sand flowed from their black bones, and its rustle fused into an eerie hum that permeated the air with a sense of primal dread. There were truly an inconceivable number of them, covering the surface of the desert like blades of grass, or possibly like the mythical warriors who had grown from the fangs of a dragon. Before, Sunny had not spared much thought to the Deathless, perceiving them as an elemental force, no different from the dark sea of the Forgotten Shore or the crushing of the Chained Isles. Now that he was close enough to divinity to be able to imagine the calamitous horror of the Doom War, at least, he could not help to be stunned by the scale of the battle that had taken place on the endless expanse of white dunes. The Nightmare Desert was a region of the Dream Realm no smaller than the Forgotten Shore. In fact, it was most likely far superior in terms of size. And yet, the Deathless seemed to be everywhere, their disorganized mass stretching far beyond the horizon. How many soldiers would it have taken to cover the surface of Godgrave completely? He couldn't even fathom the number. The war in Godgrave was a domain war, but it could also be called a realm war, because it was a conflict that had involved the entire population of a single realm, and because its outcome decided the fate of that realm. The Doom War, however, was not a realm war. It had involved the entire population of all realms, not just one, and its outcome decided the fate of existence itself. The scale and scope of the battles that had been fought between the Demon Legion and the Divine Host were therefore far greater and far more terrifying than any battle Sunny ever witnessed. It was a good thing that Sunny and Nephi's did not have to undo the curse of Shadow God and defeat the Deathless. They just had to wage a campaign that would take them to the base of the tomb of Ariel, regardless of whether the adversary was defeated or not. Asterion failed to reach the pyramid, but we won't. They had no choice but to succeed. Most of the Deathless seemed to have been human once, but not all of them. There were ghastly skeletons of gargantuan creatures among them whose original nature was difficult to guess without their hides, fur, scales, or feathers. Some were not skeletal at all, covered instead by weathered black chitin. Then there were creatures that had not been made of flesh and bone at all. Some Deathless seemed to be made from dark stone, some seemed to be made out of crystal, tattered cloth, or metal. Some were small, while some towered above the desert like gigantic monuments to the calamitous past. As Sunny watched, the Deathless remained motionless for a few brief seconds. Then, a wave of malice seemed to roll over the desert, making his hair stand on end, and they turned their skulls to regard each other with eternal hostility. Holy hell! A moment later, the world exploded with violence. The white sands rippled as myriad undead warriors lunged at each other, overcome by the relentless killing intent that had kept them enslaved for thousands of years. Their swords flashed, shaking off the rust, and their empty eye sockets seemed to ignite with a cold, eldritch, murderous darkness. The sky itself seemed to shake. Sunny glanced at Nephi's. I feel like this is going to be a long, long night. She simply stepped forward, two radiant wings shining behind her like a blinding halo. But it is nice, no? Nephi's met his gaze and smiled. For once, all we have to do is fight, don't you find it refreshing? With that, she bent slightly, then leapt into the air and shot into the dark sky. Sunny watched her go with a wistful expression. Come to think of it, it is indeed a little refreshing. When was the last time he could lose himself to the fury of a battle without thinking about anything else? When was the last time all 7 of his incarnations were gathered in one place? Sunny always had to live several lives at the same time, performing a multitude of tasks simultaneously. This time, however, he could focus fully on only one thing: conquering the Nightmare Desert. Let's go. His voice drowned in the rustle of sand as countless shades took a step forward. In front of him, the Nightmare Desert was drowning in darkness. An ocean of ancient undead was clashing silently among the dunes, the fury of their endless war so fearsome that Sunny's supreme body was being damaged slightly simply from being in proximity to the harrowing battle. The Shadow Legion flowed forward like a dark tide, but before the shades could reach the adversary, it was as if a sun suddenly ignited high in the night sky. Nephi's had channeled the name of the light once again. Using herself as its vessel this time, her radiant light illuminated the ancient battlefield, making it seem as if time had been reversed and thus forcing the night to retreat in fear before the radiance of the day. The Deathless staggered, distracted from their eternal battle by the sudden appearance of a transient sun. The empty eye sockets turned to the sky, the deep darkness in them retreating deeper. After the light came the heat. Sunny saw a bright light in the sky above him, and then a radiant white ray connected the desert to the heavens. The flawlessly white line swiped across the landscape, moving across a dozen kilometers in the blink of an eye. Then, it vanished as rapidly as it had appeared. And then the world shuddered. Out there, a distance away from the advancing Shadow Legion, a furious explosion ravaged the sea of white dunes. Following the line cut in the sand by the ray of light, the sand exploded into the sky in a terrifying conflagration of incinerating white flame. Innumerable tons of it were displaced and thrown upward, soaring high like a fiery cloud. Numerous Deathless were broken and tossed aside by the devastating shockwave, then swallowed by the fierce flame a moment later. The sand melted, turning into a fiery liquid, and the liquid glass rained from above, drowning more of the ancient undead. The first shot of the Nightmare Desert Subjugation campaign had been fired. Chapter 28:48 Desert Vanguard. A towering wall of white flame rose like a curtain, obscuring the depths of the desert. The shades in the first line of the battle formation braced as the shockwave of the titanic explosion slammed into them. Weakened by the distance it had traveled, it failed to destroy them, only serving to slow them down. A moment later, the deafening roar of the explosion washed over the Shadow Legion as well, followed by a wave of unbearable heat and finally by a boiling cloud of white sand. Glass rained from the sky, piercing the ground like shrapnel. The marching shades endured the calamitous consequences of changing stars' opening blow, rushing forward in an orderly manner. The deathless in front of them were in disarray, momentarily weakened by the aftershock of the explosion. Just before the leading shades clashed with the rearguard of the undead horde, Sunny saw another flash high in the sky above him. There was one more radiant ray of white flame that swiped across the dunes far away, causing another earth-shattering conflagration. But he did not pay it much attention, focusing on his own surroundings. The deathless were thrown off balance by the explosion and preoccupied by their eternal battle. So they suffered greatly when the Shadow Legion first descended upon them like a dark flood. Saint was the first one to engage the enemy, her black sword falling to crush an undead soldier's neck. The ancient bone proved to be all but impervious to damage though, and the blade of darkness only left a deep gash on it. Nevertheless, the dire force of the attack sent the skeleton flying into the distant flames. Moment later, Saint twisted her torso and slammed her shield into a different enemy, putting her shoulder behind it. The black bones of the deathless warrior splintered and crumbled, the broken remains falling to the ground and straining weakly to crawl. Taking a step forward, she assumed her true size, towering above the deathless who had once been human like a beautiful statue. Crimson flames blazed the visor of the helmet, and her foot fell upon the struggling foe, crushing him into dust. Slayer was not far behind, having unsheathed her blades instead of relying on her bow. She moved between the deathless like a ghost, shattering the joints that connected their skeletal limbs and throwing them down to the ground. Sadly, her weapons proved as ineffective as Saint's sword. Slayer was a sage of visiting death upon living things after all, and those cursed by Shadow God were undying. Sending a black skeleton staggering back with a graceful kick, she spun like a dancer and then leaped forward. By the time Slayer landed on the ground again, she had already assumed the shape of an enormous black tiger. Baring her fangs, she lunged at the deathless, shattering their bones with her ferocious jaws. Surprisingly enough, it was Serpent who proved to be the most lethal of the three shadows in this battle. Having assumed the shape of the King of Swords, it advanced forward with measured steps. Serpent held one of the 7 onyx swords in his hands, while the other 6 revolved around him like a rustling shield of slaying steel. With these 7 blades, it easily kept the deathless at bay, beheading them with powerful blows when they got too close. But that was not what made Serpent so deadly, if the word could be used here, in a battle against the deathless. Instead, it was the fact that every sword in a wide area around the serpentine shadow trembled and moved according to its will. Countless blades tore themselves from the hands of the deathless warriors, spinning around to aim themselves at their former masters. A whirlwind of steel raged in the heart of the undying horde, grinding the cursed warriors to dust like a bladed mill. Sunny's most powerful shades entered the battle in the wake of the 3 shadows. The immortals of the Eternal City, the bestial abominations of Godgrave, the prisoners of Ariel's game, the shadow of Daron the Serpent King, all the supreme shades as well as the strongest among the transcendent ones, slammed into the deathless horde and cut a path through it. They were led by the fierce, furious, feral shade of the wolf. Sunny lingered for a moment and then joined the fray as well. When he descended upon the battlefield in person, all of his terrifying champions suddenly seemed weak and merciful in comparison. Neglecting to manifest a weapon, Sunny chose to assume the shape of the Shadow Spawn instead and went on a rampage among the deathless. His towering body was encased in the fearsome carapace of the Jade Mantle, and he moved with an eerie, impossible kind of speed. He stepped through the shadows as naturally as if he were walking, instantly appearing near the next enemy after breaking the bones of the first. Their old bones were tough and difficult to shatter, but the strength of the Supreme Titan was simply too titanic. Subjected to his fists and his claws, the Deathless crumbled as if they had been made from straw. Of course, the ease with which Sunny broke the ancient undead was not founded purely in dire strength. Instead, it was because of his will. Sunny willed the Deathless to be broken, and so they broke. The Shadow Legion slowly but surely advanced forward and reached the wall of immolating flames. The wall was much lower by then, seemingly on the verge of being extinguished. His shadows stepped into the dying flame and emerged on the other side, ready to continue the battle. This is not that bad. Catching himself thinking that thought, Sunny grew even paler than his usual self. Damnation. No, really, was he a fool? Why you fool, why did you think that aloud? He knew that if anything could go wrong, it would inevitably go wrong. Sunny had not deluded himself into thinking that the Deathless could not present a serious threat to him and Nephi's. And now he had invited their wrath upon himself. Chapter 28:49 Testing the Waters. After the initial shock of a surprise attack subsided, the Deathless regained their cold composure and turned their attention to the third army that invaded the Nightmare Desert, the Army of Shadows. Once that happened, the advance of the Shadow Legion swiftly slowed to a crawl and then halted altogether. It was then that Sunny fully realized the strange nature of the enemy he was facing. The Deathless were not living beings, and they weren't entirely sapient either. Thousands of years spent in the desolate hell of the Nightmare Desert, locked in an endless battle, had not only stripped the flesh from their bones but had also erased all traces of their personhood. The curse of Shadow God had shattered their minds a long time ago as well. But that did not mean that they were mindless. In fact, the Deathless were quite intelligent. It was just that the scope of their intelligence was limited to one thing and one thing only: battle. And as beings who had spent thousands of years engaged in nothing but endless battle, they were chillingly proficient in decimating their enemies on the battlefield. The moment they became cognizant of a new threat, the cadence of the clash between them and the Shadow Legion immediately shifted. It was as if a chain reaction spread among the Deathless, instantly changing the patterns of their behavior. The undead warriors who had been clashing with each other now fully shifted their attention to the silent warriors of the Lord of Shadows. They swiftly formed loose and flexible battle formations, identified the weak points of the enemy force, and launched themselves into a meticulous counteroffensive, effortlessly exploiting those weaknesses to a devastating result. The weaker shades melted, destroyed faster than Sunny could comprehend the reason why the formation of his legion was suddenly crumbling. Nephi's was under more scrutiny than he was, though. That was because the Deathless had not only fathomed where the enemy's vulnerabilities lay, they had also instantly identified their own tactical deficiencies and acted to correct them. The most jarring of those deficiencies, and the main reason why the Shadow Legion had been able to advance so swiftly up to that point, was that the undead warriors were being suppressed. They were being weakened, thrown off balance, shattered, and burned by the radiant star that burned high in the sky. So the Deathless endeavored to destroy that star, or at least bring it low to the ground. Neph's radiant reign of terror came to an end when a vast mass of arrows, javelins, and makeshift projectiles rose from the dunes like a black cloud. It reached her in an instant, leaving a trail of turbulent winds in its wake. Each projectile carried enough force and murderous will to kill a Supreme, so Nephi's folded her wings and dove to the ground, weaving an erratic dance between them. It was not that these dark missiles could truly kill her. The true extent of Neph's vitality was yet unknown, but she was not going to be vanquished by these ancient weapons. The wounds they could deal her, no matter how dreadful, would be washed away by the white flames. She could have endured them on the ground, but being caught by a swarm of javelins in the air would cause her to fall. And once she hit the sand, impaled by the spears of her enemies, the Deathless could surround and restrain her. Near immortality was a sword that cut both ways. It made beings like Sunny and Nephi's difficult to kill, but also raised the stakes of being defeated to terrifying heights. After all, death was far more merciful than endless suffering. Not to mention that Nephi's needed to conserve her strength for the countless nights of increasingly deadly battles yet to come. Her body was pierced, and her radiant wings were torn, but Nephi's managed to escape the cloud of projectiles without losing control of her flight. As soon as she did, she aimed her sword at the area of the battlefield where most of the javelins had come from and unleashed fiery vengeance, condensing the immolating white flames of her soul into an annihilating beam with the help of both shaping and the blessing. It was as if the blade of her radiant sword had suddenly grown to several kilometers in length, falling down mercilessly to leave a charred wound on the surface of the Nightmare Desert. But even if many of the Deathless were shattered, a second cloud of projectiles rose into the air a few moments later. On the ground, meanwhile, the Shadow Legion was left without the protective aegis of Changing Stars' flames. That meant that the Deathless facing it were not suppressed by the obliterating pillars of heavenly fire anymore, and could thus descend upon the advancing shades with no obstacles standing in their way. The result of their unrestrained malice could be felt immediately. The Deathless sent their most stalwart warriors to bar the path of the strongest enemies, Sunny, his shadows, a few of the strongest supreme shades, and the wolf. At the same time, groups of the most deadly undead warriors attacked the points in the formation of the Shadow Legion where the weaker shades were concentrated. Damnation! Sunny stepped through the shadows, escaping the difficult opponent he had been fighting to attack a group of the Deathless who were just about to breach the formation of the Shadow Legion. His arrival postponed the crisis on that section of the battlefield, but it was of little use. The same was happening in a dozen other places, and even if he separated his incarnations, their number would not be enough to contend against the insidious attacks of the ancient undead. The offensive line of the Shadow Legion was breached in one place, then in another. Then, in a few more. By that point, Sunny had to pull his shades back in order to avoid the complete collapse of their formation. Transitioning to a defensive strategy preserved the formation and bought him time, but also made any advance impossible. Still, for the first clash against the Deathless, even this was not a bad result. What was it that Nephi's had said? Being good at failing was also a skill. As long as Sunny learned from this failure, he would be able to achieve a better result the next time. Persistence truly is the greatest of virtues. Chapter 2850 Sandworm. As the battle reached a state of deceptive equilibrium, Sunny observed his silent soldiers. The Shadow Legion was holding its ground while the Deathless refused to be pushed back. At first glance, the two opposing forces were at a stalemate, but looks could be deceiving. In truth, the weaker shades were being quickly destroyed at an alarming rate, and this kind of attrition was woefully unsustainable. Not to mention that Sunny's goal was to advance forward, not stay in place. For a moment he considered whether waging this battle was even worth it. He could just take a leap of faith and advance forward alone by jumping between shadows. He could even take Nephi's and the Shadow Legion with him if need be. However, there was a reason why they had dismissed this idea. As a Supreme, Sunny possessed an almost inexhaustible supply of essence, but that was not because his reserves of it were boundless. Rather, it was because a potent torrent of spirit essence continuously flowed into his soul, replenishing whatever essence he had spent. If his expenditure outpaced the influx of spirit essence, though, he would find himself without any to empower his aspect sooner rather than later. The Nightmare Desert was both vast and strange, denying the familiar laws of space and distance, especially so at night. So, it would take innumerable jumps to reach the tomb of Ariel, and his essence would be drained not even halfway to it, far less if he were to pull the weight of Nephi's and her longing domain with him. He could very well end up stranded in the Sea of Deathless without any essence to fight them, which was not something Sunny was willing to risk. Slow and steady wins the race. Snarling, he stepped into the shadows and returned to where Chainbreaker was anchored, hovering a couple of meters above the sand. A few moments later, Nephi's landed near him, a scattering of ghastly wounds dissolving into the white radiance emanating from her graceful body. She regarded the battlefield silently, then asked in a neutral tone, "What do you think?" Sunny hesitated for a short while, then assumed his human form and nodded. "It's doable, but we will need to change tactics." She inhaled slowly. "That is my conclusion as well." Neither of them had gone all out yet, wanting to test the waters first. Now that they had witnessed what the Deathless were capable of, there was little point in being conservative in their application of power. It was just that this battle was most likely the easiest they would experience in the Nightmare Desert, so it was not a true indicator of the harrowing perils to come. Sunny sighed. I will begin then. Nephise nodded. Give me a moment. With that, she turned her back to the battlefield, approached the chain breaker, and put her hand on its hull. A moment later, the flying vessel shimmered and disappeared in a flash of blinding radiance. It looked as if the chain breaker was a memory and Nephise had dismissed it. Of course, that wasn't the case. She had simply drawn it into her soul sea, storing it there for safety. Nephise glanced at Sunny and smiled faintly. Shall we proceed? Sunny gave her a polite bow. After you, my lady. She glanced ahead and then soared into the sky once more. Sunny began to move as well. The Deathless are surprisingly adept at strategy and tactics. If I summon the puppeteer, I can assume a more direct control of the Shadow Legion and contend against their insidious mastery of the battlefield far better. But in the end, that will only delay the inevitable. There was a certain lesson that a commander had to learn if they were to lead an army and engage in war. Despite what common logic dictated, striving to achieve the best result was not always a good strategy. In fact, excess ambition was at times detrimental and more often than not deadly. For Sunny, the best result was keeping as many of his shades as possible in the fight. But trying to preserve too many would only result in the decimation of the whole legion. Sometimes, oftentimes, sacrifices had to be made, so he had to give up on a vast number of his shades in order to achieve his goal. That was why it did not matter how finely he controlled the Shadow Legion at the moment. The role of the shades that would have been saved by his direct control was not to stay in the fight, it was to be destroyed in a way that would allow the stronger shades to advance forward. So Sunny gave the Shadow Legion a command to regroup. Instead of a wide phalanx that met the Deathless like a dark wall, his soldiers fell into a tree-pronged formation, with the left and right wings shielding the core contingent. Usually, he would have assigned his strongest champions to command the wings, but this time, Sunny simply concentrated all of his best warriors in the center. Then he dismissed the wolf. The ferocious shadow had a devastating presence on the battlefield, rallying the lesser shades while simultaneously instilling fear and weakness in the Deathless. The ancient undead must have long forgotten what fear felt like, but even they could not help but be shaken in the face of the wolf, of a primordial spirit that personified predation and chose them as its prey. However, neither the wolf nor the puppeteer was the sacred shade that Sunny needed right now. Instead, he called upon the abundance. The gigantic maw of the titanic worm exploded from the darkness in front of the central prong of the Shadow Legion, toppling the sand dunes around it. The Deathless who had been assaulting the core attempted to retreat to ascertain the new threat and come up with countermeasures, but it was already too late. The giant worm moved forward, swallowing the unfortunate undead who got in its way. Those Deathless had not been shattered and rendered harmless like the wolf's prey, but that did not matter. Because once they were swallowed by abundance, they could not attack the Shadow Legion anymore. Go carve us a path forward. The giant worm crawled across the white sand, devouring the Deathless instead of fighting them. The wings of the Shadow Legion formation protected it from being attacked from the flanks. And those shades who were arrayed behind it simply followed, their advance uncontested. Here's the chapter narration ends. I hope you like it. Don't forget to subscribe to Extreme Highlights audio novels. See you in the next narration. Thanks.